So, the first part of this report begins on board book page 27, and it's an updated report on classes under 20 and over caps for the 2019-20 school year. The first chart in the report contains classes that had board approval in March to run under 20 students. Many of these classes are intervention classes, and as you can see, many of them, with the exception of Introduction to Heritage Speakers and German 1, remain under 20 currently. The next chart contains classes that are only offered one period a day that were over 20 in March, but under the course cap. And so I know we have some board members that are seeing this for the first time. So as you can see in the far right column, we have 3 different caps. We have a 25, 30, and a 40. And when we talk about the caps, we're always looking to get into the plus or minus 2 range. So a 25 cap, we're looking to get between 23 and 27. 30 would be 28 and 32, etc. So we are reporting out at anything that was initially more than 2 students below the cap. One thing I want to call to your attention on this report is Dance 3 was initially at 25 students, and we were scheduled to run it. And then over the summer, since it was only offered one period a day, there were several students that had a conflict and had to choose whether or not they wanted to take Dance 3 or something else that was only offered that same period. And we had several students choose not to take Dance 3. So we were sitting at 12 students in the class. So at that point, given the class cap is 30, we made a decision not to run that class for this year.
Now, could we have moved the class to a different period?
Not in the summer. At that point, it's too difficult to do because we have one dance teacher who's also already scheduled to teach other classes throughout the day. And usually we catch something like that in March where we run conflicts to see are there a bunch of kids that are going to conflict out. And I don't know why they didn't catch that this year, if there was a different glitch. But usually we look at that in March when we're scheduling the classes to avoid conflicts that would make a class not run like that.
Kids can also change their mind at different
Correct.
times, right? So it could have been a timing thing.
Correct.
I had one of these other really cool classes,
Also said,
in their opinion.
yes.
You know,
Correct.
I mean, there's obviously 12 kids wanted to do this class, and then it conflicts with another class. I mean,
Also
some of these went way up, too.
Correct. Also, several of the kids in Dance 3 were also in Dance 2. So they were still getting dance, and some of them had the ability, I believe, to also go to honors repertory dance if they had auditioned and gotten in. So there were other dance options for them.
So what happens to those 12 then? Were they?
So they
What options did they
found so they found another PE class to push into. And it depends on what was offered that period as to what their choices were. And then there's one more chart on this report on the back, or on the next page in board book, and this chart contains courses that were only offered one period a day that were over 2 students in March, and then where they're sitting at enrollment wise right now. And so some of those students, it depends on the class. Some of those students, for group fitness, they choose a different PE class. For choir, chamber choir, that dropped because our choir teacher, Aubrey Prince, probably just balanced out the choirs and shifted them to another choir. So each of these situations are a little different as to why the October enrollment is different than the March enrollment.
But half of those classes are music, looks like.
Correct.
So is it common for like group fitness went from 56 to 40? I mean, 16 kids conflicted out, or?
Well, so this class is only offered one period a day, so instead of splitting that class and doing, 2 classes of 28 or 29, what would happen is, since the class cap is at 40, we would choose to run one section of it, and then some students would conflict out naturally, other students would have to choose a different PE class.
Is that like in the old college days, the last guy to sign up is the first guy out?
It depends on the class. If it's, I know sometimes we do with psychology, if all students can't get in, we'll give it to seniors first so that they have the opportunity to take it before they leave RB, and then let juniors take it the following year. So it depends on the particular course. Other questions on this one before we go to the next part of the report? Okay. So on board book page 29, this contains a final staffing summary for the 2019-20 school year. As you can see on the left part of the page on the bottom, we allocated 106.6 FTE staffing for this year, allotting 0.4 FTE for transfer students. We always reserve some FTE for transfer students in the event that we have transfer students show up in August and September. We sometimes get a late push right after Labor Day. We did not need to use that 0.4 this year, so we allocated 106.2. If you look on the right side of this paper, you can see the different class averages by department, as well as by the three different caps, the 30-1, the 25-1, and the 40-1, as well as the overall department average. Then on the bottom right, you can see we report out on the overall class average, including all of the different categories. And as you can see over the last 4 years, the class size average has dropped. This year it is 26.28. And then when you look at the overall class average without the 40-1s, so that's primarily PE classes as well as some of our music classes like choir and band and orchestra, that drops to 24.78. And then when you just look at the core classes of math, English, science, and social studies, the average class size is 24.3. And again, that's dropped consistently over the past 4 years as well. Are there any questions on this page?
So it's dropped almost 1.5 kids from 1.5, right? Core classes from 25.8 to 24.3.
Since 16, 17.
So let me explain to the board the whole plus or minus two. Like there's not an exact science to staffing or projections. And so, like, what the plus or minus two is I'm trying to give the administration to say, okay, classes that are non-core classes, so that are not a graduation requirement or class specifically for intervention or help and improve college readiness, those classes are 30-1. So, like our foreign language classes, a couple of our Kristen helped me here historically. Some of our other 30-1s besides foreign language would be.
We have some social studies as well as some applied arts classes, a few fine arts classes. I believe I said social
Okay,
studies as well.
so those are like more elective-based
English electives.
classes, right? So the 30-1, so like what we're trying to say is like we shouldn't put more than, the plus two would be 32, so we shouldn't put more than 32 kids in a class, and we should try to keep the class average no less than -2, so 28. So you're trying to kind of fit within that window if you're doing multiple sections to come up with an average. So you may have one, as a teacher, if you taught, have 3 classes, you may have one that's sitting at 31 and one that's sitting at 27, right? And so your average would be right around 30 or 29. I mean, so that's the whole idea of plus or minus 2, because there's no exact science to this. Like Kristen stated earlier, if you get 42 kids to sign up for a lab class and it's supposed to be 25-1, you got to run 2 sections, right? You can't go 42 kids in one class or tell 17 kids they can't have that required lab class. So our labs are 25-1 plus or minus 2. So I think that relates a little bit to the discussion you heard a few weeks ago about there's some concern on with science labs, there's not enough stations to be at 27. So we have to review some of our science labs numbers where there's exactly enough stations and what that cap, might need to come down a little bit so that each of the lab stations have the access to the gases and some of that stuff. And then with the bigger classes, which is just strictly some of the band classes and the PE classes, is 40-1. So we're trying to come in between 42 and 38 when we're staffing those classes.
So Kevin, on like the science class, I can't visualize the room, but would a mobile station for the plus or for the +2? In the rare situation where you do have extra students, is there a mobile, kind of like a portable station that's a solution? Or is the classroom just filled to capacity and that's not an option?
I think right now we have one station that doesn't have access to the gases. And so I'll talk with the instructional coach. We had talked about some other things. We did some modifications to another class 2 summers ago. And so we'll look at that, and if there's not enough stations, then we'll make sure that we run with enough stations. So we'll go to the next page. Kristen, is there any other questions on this page before we go into the next page? We have to do enrollment next, correct? Okay, so Kristen's going to cover that piece, and I can circle back on the staffing a little later in the presentation.
Well, I just want to make sure I understand the process here, right? So kids enroll now, or they make their course selections. Then in a March timeframe, the board gets a memo or a discussion about classes that are below the 20 number, right? Sort of just a decision to run a class.
Yeah,
moving forward.
so let me probably circle back. I should have did this introduction for
I
some
just
of
want to kind of understand the chronology here and where this exactly fits in.
Tonight you'll see enrollment projections. And the only reason we're giving you staffing projections is just to prepare the board, since that's our largest expenditure. We're preparing you for the springtime when we start to develop the budget. Why we show you the historical is since we've been here and we had to, tighten up the finances and work our way out of deficit and some of those things. So we started to do this. So we just tried to report to show you, we're not telling you class numbers and one thing in the spring, and then all of a sudden when you get to the school year, those numbers are way off. The actual staffing and course selection process is kids will sign up for classes from now and through January. I think our 8th graders, incoming freshmen, are in January after the winter break. And so once all those students sign up on courses, we kind of use the staffing projections of the enrollment to say, okay, building administration, you have 106 or 105 teachers. Now, based on the interest that students have signed up for, you can spread that number out. And then what we do is with the board is we come to you in March with courses that are under 20, but the building administration feels need to still run some of our intervention classes, or maybe a capstone language class or an AP class that we have, a good amount of students signed up for, and it wouldn't be beneficial to cut that class. So one of the reasons the board sees that courses under 20 recommendation and has to approve that is when I came here in 11-12, my first year, and we had the large deficit, we had several courses that were operating well below 20, and you're paying, those are full-time teachers in there, and we had a couple courses that had 8, 10 students, and so when we were looking at, okay, how should we start to tighten up our finances, those were some of the first courses we looked. Like if the interest level wasn't there, or the number of students signing up wasn't there, the board should be the ones to determine whether or not they run. So that's why the board approved the policy of anything below 20 needed board approval in March.
But at that same time, the scrub has taken place about the 25, 30, 40. There's nothing contemplated in a March timeframe that's above the max +2 for any of these types of classes.
Correct, because we won't really know any
Okay.
summer transfers or anything, because residency is not till July. So if a kid's transferring from LT, the first time we see them is sometime in July or August. So we don't have them accounted for.
So you could be at a 32 in a class that you would expect to be 30.
Correct.
Okay.
So if that kid came in and we could say we had 2 seats open in that class, it's already staffed at 30, to possibly put that student in that class that can go up to 32.
Okay.
And the reason why March is an important month is because based on the reduction in force laws in school code, we have to make a decision by the March board meeting. So if we were going to make a decision to cut some class or reduce the number of staff that we have on certified teachers, we would have to do a reduction in force in the month of March.
Right, by law, it's like 90 days.
So 60, yeah, it's a certain amount of school days before the end of the year that you have to give a teacher notice that you're, so that's why we start early in November, but there is a process where the students, when it comes to their electives, they will have first, second, and third choice. They have to put some other classes down because we know there are some conflicts that will come up when they're running one class or two class, or some things will happen where they may have to change. But that's why it's tied to the March date. Any other questions on some of the general stuff? I'm going to get into staffing here in a little bit once Kristen moves on with the projection part. Okay?
Okay, so on page 31, we have, on page 30, we have information from our feeder schools in regards to their enrollment from the 1920 school year. And then this information is used to create RB's enrollment projection for the 2021 school year, and then we provide a few years after that. So on page 31 is probably what you're most interested in. We have our projected enrollment for the 2021 school year. I've highlighted that in blue for you. Overall, we're projecting 1,683 students. This includes the 30 expected students that we will have in transition, and it also includes roughly 35 special education students who are outplaced and are accounted for among the freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior numbers. And so if you take all of those students out of the total, since they don't directly impact our FTE in the building, I'm projecting that we will have 1,618 students roughly attending RB next year. And so you can also see too, as we continue on in future years, we do expect a significant drop in our enrollment. In fiscal year 25, which is the 24-25 school year, we do anticipate the enrollment starting to hover around 1,600 and then dropping after that.
And this is all based on the enrollments of the feeder schools that you were given on the previous page?
Yes, correct. We use 90% of the prior year feeder enrollment in grades 2 through 8 to build out for the 2022 through 2026 school years. So those numbers certainly will change, right, because feeder schools will get more students that transfer in. And so every year I update those projections to try to get them to be more accurate as we get closer to those years.
So historically, we have been rather accurate within 5 to 10 students each year. This year, the projection was for 1,709, and we're at 1,666.
Correct, and part of the reason is, typically we have more freshman students transfer in from a variety of different feeder schools that we didn't get this year. So you can see the biggest class that we're off in is our freshman class for this year. Questions on this before we move on to staffing projections? Okay. So on the last page of this report begins on page 32. This is a chart that Dr. Skinkis began using 8 years ago to provide an estimate of the future staffing needs for the upcoming school year. If you look to the left, there's a yellow chart, and that includes required FTE. Those include positions such as instructional coaches, dean's office, counselors, social workers, things of that nature, that wouldn't necessarily be impacted by the number of students in a particular class. So that's why we pull that out. Then if you move to the center of the page, you'll see the first box is our current year. And so as Dr. Skinkis said, we were projected to have 1,709 students this year. Our current enrollment is 1,666 students, but then in-house students that are using our FTE is 1,611. And so that's a big jump because we were projecting there being 1,709, and so last year FTE was allocated assuming that we would have roughly 1,709 students, and obviously we're we're significantly lower than that. So then what we do is look at this year the number of students taking 3 to 5 classes. Don't be alarmed, most of those students are taking 5 classes. We may have like 1 or 2 students that have an exception, that they're, for whatever reason, a health reason or something, they're only taking 3 to 4. Most of those students take 5 classes. So on average, we have 65 students this year that are taking 5 classes, which gives us 325 seats. And then 6 classes, we have roughly 581 students taking 6 classes and 957 students taking 7 classes. We use the overall class average of 27 because we're including all of our classes put together for the entire building. So the ones that are at 35 are 30, the ones that are at 25, and the ones that are at 40. And so that comes out to be, when you look at that FTE needed for those classes in addition to the required FTE, it comes out to be 104.6. Again, we initially had allocated 106.6. So based off of this chart and the formulas, it's demonstrating that we are overstaffed by 2.0 FTE. But keep in mind, we didn't use 0.4 FTE, so that's really 1.6 FTE.
Before you go on to the option A, B, so let's take a minute to digest this. One teacher one FTE is 5 classes. You see the box up in the upper right-hand corner. And so, like when you look at Kristen's data, so roughly 2.4 FTE will cover the kids that take 3 to 5 classes, 25.8 for the kids that are taking 6 classes, and 49.6 for the kids that are taking 7 classes, plus the required FTE. So even if, without flipping too crazy here back and forth, if you go back to the one sheet on the original, when Kristen started on page 27, now she said we didn't use our 0.4 for transfers. So really we're at 106.2. If you look at just the first chart of classes under 20, that's a 1.6 FTE right there. So that's the, on page 27, the first 8 classes that are listed. I mean, so there's 1.6 FTE that the board approved that didn't meet any of those class counts, but the administration had brought to the board a need to run. And then if you go to the next chart, debate, having only 14 students, so there's another 0.2, right? So you're already at kind of the 1.8. So it kind of gives you, the board, an idea of, although we used 106.2 teachers and we're saying we're overstaffed roughly by 2 teachers, it shows you where a lot of those sections went, is offering opportunities for our kids in classes that maybe traditionally wouldn't run or meet the caps.
Also included in the FTE is some support staff that does not have like a class list.
Yeah, that's
yes?
the whole yellow box, the
How do
26.7.
how do you figure out
Oh, okay.
counselors or
Sorry.
social workers? How's that?
That's
Yes, I guess
that's all figured in the 26.7.
In the yellow box.
Right.
In the yellow
But-
box. So we have 5 counselors.
But that's not done by enrollment.
That's not, well,
So, how
we've
do you
tried to
get
keep it within 320, you know,
For each counselor.
for each counselor. We tried not to go over 330. I think we're pushing our max with that, but the numbers have actually gone down in like this year. So we have to keep an eye on that. We have a retiree coming up. We'll have to see where our enrollment's at.
But social workers and special ed, right? There should be a
Social
formula behind
workers,
those.
yeah, social workers, the board made a decision to hire an additional 0.6 2 years ago because of all the, we provided a report to the board to show the number of students seeing social work, students being hospitalized, having issues, social emotional issues outside of school. So the board, you know, we had Beth pull information on what would be the staffing we would need to address some of those issues. And that's how we added the 0.6. Special education, we just shifted to this process last year, but we try to have all of our 8th grade, because we know the students that are going to be here next school year that will be sophomores, juniors, and seniors. So we had our special ed director try to complete all of the 8th grade transition meetings before the end of January, so we can have a better idea of what our special ed staffing would be to recover those needs. Instructional coaches is a contractual. We have 1 librarian. ELL is a course we're required to offer, and so usually that fluctuates between a 0.6 and a 0.5 every year. credit recovery is for our students. So when you look at some of those students that are the 3 to 5, that's our credit recovery program, trying to get those students to graduate. Students that are maybe in their, it only take 4.5 years to get their diploma. Literacy coaches, we're helping with our building reading initiative. So those are certified staff members who go push into other academic courses and work with those teachers and student populations on reading strategies and reading interventions. And then this year we did an algebra academic support to strictly work with our lower performing students in our entry-level algebra classes and support algebra classes, so that they have a certified algebra teacher in their academic support working with them on tutoring and their assignments and homework and interventions. Dean's office is a .2, so next year that's one position that we'll eliminate, but we had a .2 this year as we have a dean that's retiring, and so we had a female teacher who has their administrative license do some work in the dean's office for one period a day. Also provided us a female dean. Instructional tech is Bridget Wilmot, and that's the teacher we have dedicated to working with our one-to-one initiative, supporting teachers with the technology initiatives with their Chromebooks, and also implementing the blended learning pilot for the 4 teachers this year. And then we saved the .4 roughly for transfers. And so what happens with us is that, as I stated earlier, when we do our enrollment, our registration process, any students moving into the district, we don't see them until July. So at that point, most of our staffing has to be decided in March because of the whole reduction in force. And so we try to at least say, hey, if we get a big influx of freshmen and we need to open another section of freshman English or another section of bio, something that is a required course, we have that flexibility built in there.
And as you can see, in August this year, because we had a deficit and we didn't have the number of transfers that we were necessarily anticipating, I did reduce the FTE in the budget to 106.4, but still kept that .2 because it was August, and we sometimes get transfers into September around Labor Day. You ready to move on to the 2 options?
Yeah, unless there's any questions. So we've had some historical times where we'll get a big influx of transfers, and so like we'll maybe have a staff, a part-time teacher in a department, and there's some room or there's flexibility within the master schedule to add a section, and we can do that the first or second week of school. It just kind of all depends on what specific course, where those are scheduled throughout the master schedule, what type of conflicts those would create. So it's not that it hasn't happened in the past. It's kind of dependent on luck of the draw between the transfers and master schedule and staffing issues. So Kristen will give you 2 projections, and then these are, we'll lay down a little historical kind of what you can be prepared for as we begin to do the budgeting process in the springtime. We do not make any determination of where these FTE are assigned. We leave that to the building administration to kind of figure it out. We just are trying to establish the overall number of teachers that we need to employ next year based on these enrollment projections.
And the instructional coaches work with Kylie and
Beth.
And Beth
Right.
to put all that in place, right?
Correct. And then Hector will do a final review. Me, Hector, Kylie, Beth will do kind of a final review. And that's where we kind of talk about courses that are over 20 or under 20 that may need to go forward. If there's any kind of major conflict that they forgot about that we need to go over the cap, that's where we try to get that information out so that I can prepare the board in March. Like, hey, we told you it was going to be 106.6. We had several students sign up for this capstone class, so it needs to be 106.8. So there's time in here to communicate some things to the board. Okay, Kristen.
Okay, so we typically provide 2 options to the board to kind of just give some idea of where we'll be at for next year. So option A is maintaining the 27 class average and using our projected enrollment of 1620. along with our required FTE. We are projecting that to go down 0.2. As Dr. Skinka said, we won't need the 0.2 in the dean's office. We don't anticipate needing that. So that would give us a projected FTE total of 105.1 for next year, and that does include reserving the 0.4 for transfers if needed. And then traditionally, option B has been reporting out on class size averages at 27.5, and that would be an overall FTE of 103.7.
And so, I mean, we could sit here and run, different scenarios each ways, but obviously, by just changing that 0.5, it was like 1.4 FTE. And so if we went to an average of 26.5, that would increase that. So from 105.1 probably to 106.5 or 106.4 where we're at today. The other thing that I think is important is we spent a lot of time this year really focusing on the budget expenditures. And so right now we're slated to be at, roughly a negative 400,000 deficit. So the reason we show you a couple of options in November is like if those numbers begin to come into fruition and the board wants to manage the deficit and change, this will give you an idea of the amount of staffing, either A, you can increase or decrease, and it's kind of budget impact. So that's the only reason why we give you a couple of different options.
Okay, don't we have kind of like a rule for our core classes?
So when in 2011-12, I started in July. So the first time I gave this report was in November of 2011 as we got prepared for my second year and some of the cuts that we were going to need to make. And so after, I think, my first 2 or 3 years, we started to make a commitment as we began to get on stable financial ground and having some surplus budgets and being balanced and beginning to build back up the fund balance. What we did is we made a commitment to go with the math, science, English, the required courses, core courses. We started with the freshman class of maybe 2016, and then we focused on their core classes and trying to be at a 25-1 or 27-1 with the +2, right? And then every year we added. So right now, all 4 of our classes for whether it's freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior, the core classes like the required math, the required English, science, we try to stay within below the 30-1, more on the 27-1 class average.
So,
Because there was a while where it was all 30-1.
right, so with this table, and we have the weighted kind of seats where everything's kind of lumped together, and again, it's up to the board. I think it might be a little helpful to see almost 2 columns, what are we looking at for an average for our core courses, and then an average for like non-core courses.
Well, I think you saw that if you go back to page 29, that's why we give this report now, so that once all this is shaken out, you can see on the bottom of page 29, we have that all broken out. So currently, our core classes of math, science, English, and social studies, our average class size is 24.3, and then it gives you the historical average for the last 3 years before that. Then for overall class average, this includes our band and PE classes that have a 40-1, or without the 40-1. So that's just more of our foreign language, some of our English electives, social studies electives. That's 24.7, and then our overall with everybody in there is 26.2. So if you ran my chart at 26.28, with our current year, if we, instead of having 27 in that top colored chart, if you ran it at what our current averages, it would come out that we're staffed exactly where we should be at 106.2 or 106.4. But when we did the projection for the board, we used 27-1 last year in November, and we used based off of the 1709 minus the transition students, which is how we came up with the 106.6.
So is the .4 transfer, did I hear you right, is that still in the budget, or is that you're waiting till after the Thanksgiving holiday to see if any additional transfers come in.
This year, we took out .2 in August.
So there still is .2 in there.
And there's still .2 in there. In my opinion, it wouldn't make sense to amend the budget just for that .2. And that's why we try to shave it off in the summer if we don't think that we're gonna need it before we adopt the final budget.
But it also means we're gonna see either salvage or something.
Correct.
Along those lines. And then on the special ed allocation, right, the 13.3, I know Kevin explained how that was, kind of came to be. How closely is that looked at in terms of adequacy, knowing the population we have moving into the district, knowing the individuals we cover, after graduation? What kind of deep dive can we get on the special education number, and is it too high, is it too low?
So
Is it spot on?
So one thing that you don't see is in February, when Kylie and Beth sit down to do the staffing with the instructional coaches, there are 2 additional special education spreadsheets. One is strictly looking at co-teaching, and it looks at the number of students that need co-teaching in each of the courses that we offer co-teaching in, and then we determine based off of those numbers how many sections need to be co-taught. And that's so that we can try to stay under the 30% of students in that class that need co-teaching. That's in an ideal world. I can tell you that's not our current reality. But so we have that co-teaching spreadsheet where we look at all the co-teaching needs based off of student IEPs. Then we have another spreadsheet for special education, which is courses that are offered within the special education department. So that would be like our vocational class or our core classes. So if a student isn't able to push into a general education class, we have special education teachers that teach small section English classes or science classes. And so we look at those needs. Those needs stay rather consistent from year to year because if a student most likely has that need as a freshman, they most likely have that need all 4 years. We do sometimes are able to push a student out into a co-taught class, but usually that's pretty predictable. So we use those 2 spreadsheets to come up with the 13.3.
Okay.
So that's what happens behind the scenes for that number.
Is everybody familiar with what is co-teaching? Okay. So Sheila Jersis, the special ed director, is scheduled to speak to the Board of Education on December 10th, so we can have her go into a little more detail of what goes into her staffing allotment and her staffing process, the 8th grade transition process. And then I know the board wanted to hear a little bit more about the overall finances and the trends in special education at RB during her tenure. So I'll have her, I'll make sure those points are laid out and that she can talk to those at December 10th. So, long story short, I know we threw a lot of information at you. Will be available on the website to review. We should be around 105 teachers next year, give or take. 0.2, 0.4, something in that area.
Do all our teachers work a full schedule, a 1.0 FTE?
No.
Okay.
So, that number may be, 110 people equal that 105.1 or our current 106.2. Right? We have some departments where maybe they have 14.5 FTE, 14.8 or 10.2, right?
We probably have roughly 8 or 9 certified staff members that are part-time.
So with the certified staff members that are part-time, is that where we would get flexibility to fill different, like one section was higher than you expected, is that where you can pick up some flexibility?
Yeah, that would certainly be the easiest, trying to find a .2 science teacher in September to come in and teach for 50 minutes a day when they're not already tied to the building is not very realistic. It certainly can happen, but We haven't experienced much luck with finding a quality teacher for that particular situation. That also poses another challenge because let's say at that point you realize that class is, or all of the biology classes are full at 28. If you bring in a teacher to teach one period, you don't get to redistribute all of those biology classes among now that one extra section. It's just that one period gets alleviated because you can't really change all of these kids' schedules in September to try to balance things out at that point. So that's the other problem that it poses, is that you're really only solving that class size for that one period where you add that extra teacher.
And this is where, like, I'm sorry, Laura, this is where, just like the budget process, some of you had made comments in the past, like, why are we approving our budget in September when we already been operating out of it for three months, right? June, July, August, and half of September. It's kind of the same thing, like, so we do the staffing selections in January, course selection through January. We try to figure out the FTE count and get a number to the board. So if we have to reduce in force, or if we need to post and hire, we can do that in the spring. We have to let teachers know an idea of their master schedule and their assignment in May. And then we have registration in the summer where we might get an influx of students, or maybe this year you'll get an increase in juniors we weren't expecting. And so that's why we leave that 0.4 to try to do some shifting around to those sections. And we try to, when Beth builds the master schedule, she tries to build some flexibility in the core classes so that if we do get an influx of transfers, there can be some movement, but there's not a lot that can occur necessarily come August.
But if we get that anomaly, the one class that now is larger than expected, could anything be alleviated with some of our part-time certified staff co-teaching and some unique configuration of a course where you would now have 2 certified instructors during the same period, and you're maybe kind of swapping lecture and lab, kind of swapping out, almost overlapping the same space?
I think it would be probably more cost efficient if we added a teacher's aide in the emergency situation, if there's that. I think like the situation that was brought up about the chemistry is that at that point there's only so many stations, right? So either we got to look at how we're staffing those classes with the number of stations and if that needs to be reduced. But I think at some point adding another teacher, if there's not enough stations there, it's not, adding another teacher isn't going to remedy that problem, right?
Well, if you had somebody who was part-time and they added another 0.2 FTEs, and then if you were able to split the classroom where half are doing lecture and you could maybe use some room in the library or whatever and half are doing labs, and kind of swap that out in a situation that's an anomaly, I don't know if that might work for a one situation, and you're only picking up, a 0.2 FTE, but you're getting certified staffing.
Yeah, we have done that in the past, for example, with Western Civ, a few years ago. The challenge is we've certainly then alleviated that class period, but all the other Western Civs throughout the day are still going to be stuck at that higher number because it's not fair to try to shuffle a kid's entire schedule around in September to get them into that now smaller class. So that's the challenge that we face with that.
Any other questions? Okay. Any other comments? Anything? Okay.
So is that it?
That's it for now.
Wow, that's a
We
big
have more reports later.
more reports later.